welcome back. We're going to do this next bit in English. And we'll have a discussion here and then afterwards also open it up to the audience. Obviously, you're very welcome to ask in German as well. I can translate. So I think I'll start by introducing the three of you. I'll start with Kathy on my left. Kathy Wheeler is curator of the Irma Stern Trust collection housed at the Irma Stern Museum. And I have known her for almost 10 years now. And she has been lovely supporting my PhD project and especially also this exhibition. As has been mentioned before, we have a lot of works here that are usually shown as core exhibits at the Irma Stern Museum. And it's really most generous of you to not even blink an eyelid and to say, yeah, please have it. Take it all to Berlin. Okay, and then to my right is Gcotyelwa Mashiqa. This is 80% correct, she said. And Gcotyelwa is curator of contemporary collections at the Johannesburg Art Gallery. And she did an interview with us for the catalog. So please all buy the catalog and read her interview because it's very interesting. And she has kindly agreed to also contribute personal statements for the exhibition and is here with us today. And then on the very left is Alastair Meredith, and he's Senior Art Specialist and Auctioneer at Strauss & Co., a South African auction house that has done amazing research, really, into individual works by Irma Stern. And Alastair is a true expert, and an art historian, I think, who can give us a very good context also for Irma Stern within South African art history. And I think that's probably what we'll start with to make everyone a bit more familiar with the South African context of her work. So.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you all for coming. It's so wonderful to be here. It's my first time in Berlin, and I have to say I'm enormously proud to, as a South African, to see a show like this here in Berlin. You know, so many rock star paintings by Irma Stern, all in one place, and to see so many people see the show and hopefully enjoy it. It is wonderfully exciting, and as I say, I feel very proud as a South African art historian. But I suppose to give a bit of context to Irma Stern from a South African perspective, she's always been the pin-up artist in a South African context. She's always been seen as the most important South African modernist. Why? I think the very short answer would be because she was a dazzling and sophisticated painter. You know, I think you'd hopefully agree with me just looking at all the works around us. I think the fact that there weren't too many dazzling and sophisticated painters working in South Africa in the teens and 20s and 30s, I think also helped her reputation. She was so unusual in so many ways. She had a genuine avant-garde European training, so her style reflected that. And again, I would argue there weren't many South African artists working at the time with that kind of background. But she also had a larger-than-life persona. You know, she was very flamboyant. She was always polarizing. She was endlessly controversial, but I think she was always seen as being supremely talented and an artist who really put together a remarkable body of work, you know, over a very long career. I also always like to think that Irma Stern and her output was a incredible fluke of history. You know, the idea that this girl of sort of German Jewish background is born in the 1890s in the old Transvaal Republic in South Africa, who then trains and works at the coalface of German Expressionism, sort of through the First World War. And then goes back to South Africa with that kind of influence and understanding, and is able to paint landscapes and people in that completely different context. It is really quite remarkable. And the idea that an artist like that could then go on and paint Omani nobility in Zanzibar, for instance, or in the then Belgian Congo, as I say, is a sort of a historical freak moment, but one that I think we'd all be very grateful for. I also think to give a bit of background to her personality is important. She was, in my opinion, enormously courageous and brave. You know, the idea that she needed stimulus all the time. She needed to see things and paint things and understand things, drove her career. I always like to think of what she did, particularly during the Second World War, when she could no longer travel to Europe. When the world was at war, the North African campaign was sort of in full flight, and she was unable to leave the country. And at that moment, she decides now is a good time to travel to Zanzibar or the then Belgian Congo, just before Rommel's forces take Tobruk, and paint the people there and the landscapes there. Yes, as I say, it's just quite remarkable. She still remains, I think, in the South African public's imagination, the most important painter. She was always fated in her life. She always exhibited at the major biennales. She showed at the Venice Biennale in 1950, 52, 54, 58, Sao Paulo in 1957. She was always exhibiting in Europe. She was always exhibiting back in South Africa. And as I say, she was always seen as enormously important. I think the controversy around her life and her style in particular also helped her. The idea that when she came back to South Africa, when she came back to Cape Town in 1920, and she started exhibiting works like this in a hyper-conservative gallery-going society, gallery goers and reviewers just could not cope with a young woman painting like this. They were used to sort of staid, gentle Cape Impressionism, and to get a young artist with these fiery sort of neon colors was something they just weren't expecting. And over time, she really molded, I think, the South African art-going public and their understanding of what modernism is and the power of modernism, and her influence through the country really from the 1920s is absolute, I would argue, across white and black artists in South Africa. She was also ruthless, I think. She was very selfish. She was hyper-aware of how to build her career. Sometimes she was a little bit naughty about how she maybe suppressed some of her rivals. Those of you that haven't heard of Maggie Laupscher, I think you should maybe look her up. She was one of Stern's contemporaries who also, trained in the German Expressionist mode and spent a lot of time in Europe. And Stern didn't like the idea of a potential upstart and rival, and she managed to suppress her in various ways. But I suppose to end off that very long answer, she was always deserving, I think, of all her accolades. And I think, as I said earlier, we're very proud of her as South Africans.
Yeah, we definitely had some concerns about so much of South Africa's national heritage leaving the country, on one plane especially. So we're really very grateful also to all the other lenders that you trust in us. And yeah, I hope coming here you can see that it was worth it. Maybe just one follow-up question. How important do you think in South Africa for the reception of Irma Stern is the fact that she was part of the Brücke context while she was in Berlin.
The which context, sorry, Lisa?
The Brücke artist?
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that definitely helped her early on in her career. You know, the fact that she had very strong, real links to the Brücke artists and the November group and Max Pechstein in particular. You know, that gave her some credit, I suppose, some sort of European endorsement in a South African context. Stylistically, of course, her temperament, you know, really suited, I think, the Brücke artist and Max Pechstein in particular. But I think her sort of high expressionist phase of the late teens and early 20s changes quite dramatically as her career matures. She was also very different, I think, to the Brücke artist in some ways. I don't think she was a purely intellectual painter, you know, as so many of the Brücke artists were. You know, she, as I said earlier, she needed stimulus. You know, she needed to see people and be inspired by her sitters and her still life compositions and travel in particular. I don't think she maybe has the kind of sense of uncertainty and maybe deep anguish that you maybe get in the genuine Brücke works from a little bit earlier. But it absolutely was a stepping stone for her to have that kind of very real exposure. You know, I always tell people in South Africa that come to our exhibitions and shows that she was not a peripheral figure of German Expressionism and die Brücke and the November group. She was very much part of it. And had circumstances been different, she would have been perhaps far better known in terms of her association with those groups. But I think stylistically, particularly in through the 30s and 40s, her sort of paintwork shifted a little bit further away from die Brücke artists, and that really electric Fauvist palette that you'll see sort of next door, and it's amazing to have some of Irma's works next to the likes of Max Pechstein and Kirchner. They were a little more subdued, I think, through the 30s and 1940s, as you can sort of see by the pictures behind me.
Thank you so much. So, Kathy, I wonder, when you came here, whether you felt a connection, because the Irma Stern Museum, like the Brücke Museum, is also built on the vision of one particular artist. It's also a bit outside of town, more in nature rather than the urban areas, close to the university, actually. Can you tell us a bit about how the funding of the museum came about and the first phase of the Irma Stern Museum?
Certainly. It was very interesting coming here for the first. Is it?
Yeah, I think.
Just go for it. You tell me.
Or hold it a little closer to your mouth.
Okay. Wow. It was very interesting coming here for the first time because I found this is such an intimate museum with the low ceilings and especially looking out at the green and the trees. And I've just found Berlin absolutely amazing. I've never been here before. And the thing that just strikes one is the greenness and the trees and how beautiful everything is. So one did feel a tremendous sense of connection coming here because it is the same thing in Irma's house. You look out and the same thing, it's very shady and there are lots of trees and a lovely big garden. So one arrived and thought, gosh, I really feel at home here. And what I also loved was the way that you've hung all the portraits are at eye level, which in some cases in the House Museum, because it's a house, so there's not a lot of space. So I'm afraid we've rather stacked things a bit, which means that some of the portraits are up. And then you don't get this connection. So I'm sorry to say, when I go back and things come back, I'm warning you, Frank, I'm going to rehang everything. Just to let you know. But just to say what a fabulous opportunity this has been. Irma would have been thrilled to the back teeth, because that was the whole point of what she wanted. A lot of people don't realize, you usually think when you have a museum, all museums have collections. Well, this is a little bit different, because when Irma died, she left her collection in trust. And there was a board of trustees, and she gave them quite substantial powers, because they had to go through everything that was in her house. And that sounds, wow, must have been a total headache to actually work out what was going to form part of the Irma Stern collection. So that was their first job. And the second job was she wanted her works to be on display and housed, and she wanted them to be promoted both inside and outside of South Africa. So I think she gave her trustees quite a headache, because number one, the original trustee, who was a Professor Scholz, who was an art lover himself, had to go through this enormous house with everything that was left there when she died. And then he had to make up his mind what was going to be in the collection. And of course, she'd also said, and what isn't in the collection you have to sell. And which brings me to the next point, which was she, I think, never said there had to be a museum. In fact, she wanted the house to be sold to raise capital to look after her collection, because that was the trustee's job as well. So now they had to work out what on earth were they going to do with this. And various institutions like the South African National Gallery came and offered space. And then there was a strong movement of friends of Irma Stern, and people that knew her said, but this is ridiculous. You've got the artist's house, it's unique, it has stamped with her own personality. And so therefore it should be kept on as a museum. And thank heavens people saw sense, because it very nearly, the chairman of the board of trustees and the chairman of the University of Cape Town is a gentleman called Clive Corder. And he came up with a solution: why doesn't it all go into her house? He wasn't terribly keen, because he said, oh, well, you know, it's an old house and it's going to cause trouble and blah-de-blah-de-blah. But fortunately, enough people said, look here, you know, you cannot take it out and recreate her studio in another house, in another building in the university. So as luck would have it, no building was ready. And if it was going to be, it was going to take a number of years. So he said, okay, fine, we'll fix up the Firs, which is the name of her house. And then in a few years' time, when something comes available, then we'll move it. And thank heavens for everybody that didn't happen. Because what is more special than an artist's house where she lived and she worked and she went on her travels? I think she bought it the year after she got married in 1927. And from then until she died in 1966, that was her place. And what is so special about it is, usually my special interest is house museums and how they work. And usually what happens with a house museum is you get the house, but there's no collection. Then you've got to go and recreate something, but it's not the genuine thing. Whereas here, what have we got? Everything that belonged to Irma. And it is so special, and there's the atmosphere. Not only did Irma live there and work there, but she moved in and she bashed walls down because she said, I've got so much stuff, I need space. And she then, having gone to Zanzibar, as you said, changed the front door. She put in a Zanzibar door. I gather, I think after that, Zanzibar put its foot down because now you're not allowed to do things like that anymore. And she also took a center post and used that for the mantelpiece. And then Irma as well, to make it truly her own, she didn't like empty spaces, so she went and painted doors. And then she took the original sort of front door, became glass, and we call it stained glass, but it isn't really. I mean, it sort of looks like that because it's painted on it. So all in all, it's a really unique place. And what I find is so interesting talking to visitors, because with these sort of houses, they actually feel they come in and she's there and they can communicate with her. And you read the visitor's book and there are things like, "Dear Irma Stern, I wish I could become as good an artist as you are," sort of thing. And so that's what's so special, is it's the artist's house and people relate to it. And I wish I could pick you all up and take you to be at home with Irma Stern, because that's what we try to do for our visitors. And what also makes it special is all these wonderful people come walking in the door. Like in January last year, we had this wonderful delegation that arrived. So, of course, we said, absolutely, what a wonderful opportunity. What would you like to borrow? As we get PhD students and all sorts of things. So I'm a very lucky lady. I guess I'm one of the few people that bounces out of bed every day and says, look what I've got, all this wonderful stuff to enjoy. So there.
Thank you so much. I think everyone has a very good idea now of what the Irma Stern Museum looks like. And yeah, everyone's buying plane tickets to Cape Town. Okay. Gcotyelwa, I think it would be nice, since probably most people are not familiar with the Johannesburg Art Gallery, if you could give us a little bit of background on the history of the museum that you're currently working for.
Hello, everyone. So the Johannesburg Art Gallery is located in the center of Joburg, in the Joburg Park. The building or the museum was opened in 1915, starting with the collection from the Dutch and the European, the English, and the rest of Europe. It's a colonial museum, which is very unique, not unique, but very so much tells about, some of the museum in the country itself. And then in the late, I think, 40s, that's when they started collecting art from South Africa, specifically the likes of Irma Stern. And in 1946, to be specific, they started collecting. It was the first time that they collected a black modernist South African painter, Gerald Sokoto. So the collection is vastly more on the European, which is the prints, the paintings, and the sculptures. And then later in the year, different directors coming into the museum started collecting what is called contemporary art, and until this moment. But the museum, the infrastructure is such in a dire situation to a point that we haven't collected since, I think, before COVID. That's when we stopped collecting. So it's one of the best collection in the country, if not in the continent, with obviously, yesterday I was talking to a friend and I was like, I'm obsessed with German expressionism because I do find some of those works in the collection. So that is the Johannesburg Art Gallery, but also it's a very important institution in the South African art history. The first Biennale to happen in the continent, it took place in the Johannesburg Art Gallery in 1992. And there was another important exhibition, which was a kind of a response to the Magician de la Terre, which took place in 1989 in France. It's one of the important exhibitions that included some of the African artists. That's when some of the African artists were no longer, or art from the continent was no longer in the kind of ethnographic section of the museum, right? And so the African Remix was a response to that kind of exhibit, to that Magician de la Terre, which took place in Paris, which is a very seminal exhibition in the history of South African art history. And it happened at the Johannesburg Art Gallery. So it's a very important institution that sort of sets the tone of what is currently happening right now in our art world in South Africa. I've been there for 2 years, but it's also been an institution that has always been on my radar as a student, and also being trained in museum studies, but also trained in curatorship. So it's a very important institution. And even though, I mean, the origin of it is very colonial, but I also think that even the works that are within the collection are also implicated in that history, right? Even the contemporary works that have been acquired in the late 40s or late 60s, even now in the 2000s, I feel like because of that history, the foundation of the museum, it's still implicated. So we're working with the colonial collection and histories as well. So yeah, that's what I could just briefly say about the JAG. I won't go into who's the architect and all of that. But if you go online, you'll probably find that information, because I'm also not good with dates and names.
Thank you very much. When we were visiting, we talked, and also in our interview, actually, in the catalog, we talked a lot about the audience that you get at the JAG. And you said that especially Black school groups from the neighboring area are a target audience. And maybe you could tell us how you mediate works from this colonial collection, which Irma Stern is a part of, to young Black audiences.
We are situated in a very unique place. It's overcrowded. It's also a place, there's like residential buildings around it. There's a lot of commercial businesses as well. There's a taxi rank. I don't know if people understand taxi rank. It's more like a place where there's a local transportation for people, for commuters. And therefore we are having this very different people from across the continent who live there. It's not just only South Africans, but we're dealing with the people from the rest of the continent. And mostly our visitors, the people who just come to the museum, it's mainly primary high school kids. And then we also have universities close by, University of the Witwatersrand, the University of Johannesburg. Those are the closest universities. So, but mainly our community, the people that we think about when we're preparing for exhibitions, it's mainly like kids, primary school kids. So it is really hard it was quite a challenge for me specifically to think about exhibitions as a curator because of my position. I think as if I was an education officer, I would be sensitive to the kind of community that I'm speaking to, that I'm, producing these shows for. But as a curator, I've always been thinking about academics, university students, you know, people who really understand art intellectually, beyond just coming and seeing a painting by Irma Stern, but people who also think about the history behind these paintings. But with this, when you guys came, I can't remember what month was it. I had just put up an exhibition. I was very new in the museum. I had not even finished a year. And my task was to do an exhibition. And I had to use the collection, which I was grateful for because it was my way of, it was an opportunity for me to just understand and see and know what's in this collection. And I included I think I kind of centered the exhibition around beauty. What is Black beauty in 2023? And what is beauty in the context of a colonial museum and a colonial collection, right? But also myself having implicated in that history because I work there. It's the collection that I've been tasked to take care. So therefore I am implicated in those histories, right? So what is the position that one has to do? How do you navigate those kind of histories? Those are the kind of thoughts that comes into mind when you're dealing with artworks or with collections that have so much heavy and difficult history. But also as a Black woman in South Africa, right? So those are the kind of thoughts that one I constantly have to have in mind. And secondly, that the colonial project, colonial history, it's such a complex thing, but it's also full of contradictions. So as the decolonial practice, so is the decolonial project. It's also full of contradictions. And I think we have to be kind of aware of those contradictions because there isn't a very clear way that is pure decolonial or anti-colonization. Everything is tempered with. So the show was basically for kids, and I was thinking about beauty, Black beauty. What does Black beauty looks like? And what did I wanted to communicate to them. And so one thing, I pull up some of the artworks that I just thought of immediately from the top of my mind. And Irma Stern was there, not because she was at the top of my mind, she wasn't. Mom Helen Sibidi, one of our South African artists, was at the top of my mind. It was women artists, but again, there's so many gaps in our collection in a sense that even if you want to put up a woman show, it's very important, like a woman, Black painters, it's so difficult. You'll find like 4 or 5 within the collection. That speaks also to the kind of acquisition process or the acquisition process of this museum. So Mom Helen Sibidi was the focal point for me. And then from there, I started to think about other artists who were in the collection. And Irma Stern was very much part of this exhibition. I don't center her in my work, but I use her to tell a different story. I use her as an illustration, but also I use my exhibition for people to kind of come in and to sit with whatever they're getting from Irma or from other artists or from Mom Helen Sibidi, for example, to kind of sit with and just sort of sit with these histories, sort of sit with this heaviness, if that's what people are experiencing, sort of sit with the beauty of Irma Stern's portraits. And yeah, so the kind of exhibition that I did was about that, was about beauty, was about these kids, when they come in, they can look up and look at themselves and see the beauty. You know, it was really about that. And how I sort of displayed the exhibition, or the display method was sort of like a salon style. Again, I'm taking back from the Expressionism movement. Which very much inspires me, because that's the education that I had when I was studying art, of not focusing on one particular artist, right? But you see this kind of like a tableau, kind of a display, or a puzzle kind of a display, which does not center anyone. But it kind of gives you a general feeling, but it also allows you to slow down and sit and look without having to pay particular attention to one artist. But also, I think for me, there's this suspension of certain histories in that moment, right? That one can just remove the sort of negative aspect, but and get to look at the beauty, whether from an aesthetic point of view, or from a kind of a historical point of view. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do we have any first questions in the audience, maybe? If I don't see your hand, please raise it higher. Okay, yeah, Philippa, okay.
It's not a question, more just a statement about a couple of the pieces here and the kind of dismissive about the fact that Irma wasn't an intellectual. The one piece on that back wall on the left, I believe the title is Malay Child or Bride. So the sitter there is probably somewhere between the ages of 10 and 12. Irma executed her in the same palette and style that Vincent van Gogh used in some of his own self-portraits. And I strongly believe in the research I've done that Irma deliberately chose that to make sure that us as future generations would be looking at a work like that and understanding just how wrong the position was that that child was in to be forced into a marriage. And then the second piece that I'd also like to bring to everyone's attention is Made in Uniform, which was painted in 1955. And that's centered to the wall here on my right. Now that work, has been criticized for the fact that the sitter's name is not there. However, 1955 was the same year that black women in South Africa marched against the apartheid laws and the pass laws that were particularly punitive against themselves as black women. And that isn't just one woman, it's an entire nation of women who were fighting for their rights. And I think that's where people need to start looking more closely at Irma's work, is in the fact that she wasn't just a portrait painter, and she didn't just paint pretty flowers. And her landscapes also show a lot more than just being empty. And I think that's where the most interesting conversation is going to come in the future for Irma.
Yeah, thank you very much. Anybody else? Or maybe, I think this is the first time the three of you are on a panel together. Maybe you would ask each other something? Okay, audience first.
Thank you. I'm very interested in what Mrs. Mashiqa was saying about your background as curator and art historian, and why that doesn't center one particular artist. It would be wonderful to listen more about what you think about that, and why this is important. You mentioned that your background involves not just centering one particular artist, and I would like to listen more about it, if that's okay.
I think in this context of the exhibition that I was describing is Black South African women artists don't have much visibility, right? And the way that they have been written into our history, or art history to be specific, it's very minimum compared to the likes of Irma Stern, right? There hasn't been support of Black women artists in South Africa. But this one, because I was very conscious of the kind of history that surrounds Irma Stern. I mean, there was Maggie Lobsher as well, and that, you know, there were different also European white artists were in that kind of salon display, and the focus for me is that Black people have been written in a way that is so undermining and racist. That's why I didn't want to center, because if I go individually and put up the work, for example, by Irma Stern, then I am co-opting in a way, or co-signing all these negative stereotypes that have, have been written about Black people in general. So for me to not center, because one is the issue of, I'm also bringing up gaps that are within the collection, right? I'm also bringing up disparity in our collection process, how the collection or the acquisition process took place. It was focusing, there's more white South African artists in our collection than Black South African artists, do you understand? So I'm also bringing up these disparities, and for me to be able to communicate this message that I want to communicate to this audience that I'm doing this for was not to center a particular artist. But if I were given an opportunity, I would center one artist and do an exhibition about it. But because of the lack of works, and yeah, I'm not going to go into other things. But yeah, so that was the reason why I didn't want to center one artist, because of, if we zoom in, then I'm telling not the story that I want to tell. I don't want to regurgitate what has already been out there by focusing on one particular artist. And the aim is to kind of tell a different story. To kind of a humanizing story about us. And it was for kids, so I wanted to give them a good reflection, something that they can be proud of, right? Without the burden of the history.
Thank you. It is most interesting to listen to you as a panel, and I think for me as an art collector, an art enthusiast who knows about Irma Stern and who's lived intimately with some of her works, I have learned things here today which I find extremely enriching. I also enjoyed when Alastair spoke about the fact that it may not have been your words, but that in addition to being a highly intellectually perceptive and aware person, she also really went into the emotive side of things. That I enjoyed very much. And I think my question, to bring the focus back to Irma Stern, which is why we're here today, is I want to ask Alastair if he thinks that when he mentioned that there's a bit of a development over the years from her early works to her later works, I want to ask you, what do you perceive that change to be, and how does it relate perhaps to intellect and emotion?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Azelle. Yes, I suppose to kind of recap, I think very early on in her career when she was working in Berlin and working much closer with the likes of Max Perstein, that very sort of high-key Falvus palette was very much part of her style. But when she is back in South Africa and traveling around Southern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, it is toned down a little bit. I would maybe like to argue, especially when it comes to her portraiture, that she was looking very, very carefully at the individuals. And yes, it's I suppose sometimes a controversial topic to talk about, in terms of the exotic or the other or the generic compared to the personal. But I think if you look at so many of these wonderful portraits around us, there was a very real sense of Irma studying and appreciating and painting an individual. And I think stylistically, that is reflected in the fact that maybe the palette is slightly more toned down. I think the brushwork is maybe slightly shorter. It's not quite as flamboyant and as expressive maybe as it was in a sort of pure high expressionist phase in the 1920s. I think that's one of the major shifts as well in terms of the style.
There was one other question. Yeah, I'm coming.
Well, this is not a question of art, really, but I'm asking Alastair. I believe her works of art are auctioned at Sotheby's. Her works of art are auctioned at Sotheby's by your company. I'm just wondering how much are they going for? That's just a
how much they're going for? Yeah, fair enough. I can tell you some of the prices of some of the works hanging on the wall right now, but I won't. You can go look at our website, Strauss Art. We've handled a number of these works, and you can see some of the pricing. I think what's wonderful from an art market perspective when it comes to Irma Stern is that she is still accessible. Bearing in mind that she's arguably one of the country's most important or well-known artists. You can still buy her work, whether it's her etchings or her lithographs or her gouaches or works on color, works on paper rather, for relatively achievable, affordable sums. But in reality, yes, many of her major works in a South African context are very, very high value. So yes, we are talking in the millions of euros, for instance. Which is very exciting. I think a related question I'm often asked is, so tens of millions of rands, but millions of euros. The other question I'm often asked is, was Irma rich? Was she wealthy? And yes, she was. She was very well off, in that she was independently wealthy. And that is a major factor, I think, in her career. The reality that she was able to travel around the world. She was able to put her car on a train and send it to Elizabethville in 1942. And hire a chauffeur to drive her around the then Belgian Congo. That was very, very important. She never lacked for high-quality canvases or oils. And that's very unusual in a South African context. If you look at Irma's works from the 1940s, they're often on beautiful canvas. If you look at some of the other artists working during the Second World War, they often painted on curtains and things like that, stretched over armatures. So the fact that she was independently wealthy was of huge significance. When she sold her pictures, and she was exhibiting all the time, I think she was hyper-aware in terms of her own reputation that her paintings needed to be expensive in order for people to value them. She was a very shrewd self-promoter. That wonderful portrait there of Frida Feldman in that Basotho hat. I know that the Feldmans paid that off over years. They were a wealthy Johannesburg couple, a great supporter and patron of Stern, and they were buying her works all the time. But they couldn't buy them outright. you know, they were always paying Stern back monthly to over decades in order to purchase her work. So yes, that factor I think is very important in the context of her career.
Just add to what you said is that she was a terrific businesswoman. And she actually, if you look in the National Library of South Africa, is her account book. And so she kept tabs on everybody that owned and ticked it off and so on. So she was, and then the other thing you were mentioning, that she was financially secure. She actually had a few doubts before her mother died. They weren't getting on terribly well. So Irma was going to convert the upstairs of the Furs into a flat for further income in case her mother didn't leave anything to her. But then when everything's sorted out, fortunately, she inherited from Mama. So then she was absolutely fine.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we're going to move on now with our program, but our lovely guests will be here, I think, a little longer. So I'm sure if you have more questions, you can approach them and ask directly. Thank you again so much.